Hey everybody, welcome to Introduction to Air Intercept Control. Before we get started, we have to go over a couple of terms. First, we have Air Intercept Control, Air Intercept Controller. They're both used to kind of describe the same thing, and that is the people and the systems that we're going to cover in this exercise. Next up is AWACS, and that is Airborne Warning and Control System. So let's have a look at two different kind of AWACS that exist on the blue side in DCS. And that's the E2 Hawkeye and the E3 Sentry. And they both more or less do the same thing in the game. One of them is carrier-based, one of them is land-based. The E3 has a larger detection range and it can stay on station a little bit, or quite a bit longer, I believe. The E2 has shorter range, but because it's carrier-based, you can bring it more places, especially once the new maps come out that are more sea focused. And in practice, one of those would actually be assigned to each wing. So AWACS is an airborne radar system. It's a huge radar dish on top of a plane. And there's a couple reasons why it's on top of a plane. First, so that they can move it around. It's not stationary. And second, so that it's looking down. That allows it to see behind physical terrain features that would otherwise block radar. And inside the AWACS, there's a group of people. And those people are called air intercept controllers. And what they do is kind of manage the battlefield. They're checking in on the flights. They're telling people where to go. They're providing information to flights based on what they see. They basically build a picture, and that's what they call it, is a picture of everything that's going on within their radius. They provide that information when they're asked to. They broadcast that information if something new happens, if something notable happens. And in some cases, they will actually direct the battle. So that's a really simplified explanation of what AWACS is and how it works. So AWACS is there to provide information and control. Let's talk about the different kind of control that they provide. The first type of control is called close control. And during close control, the controller is responsible for fully guiding fighters during an intercept. The next type of control is tactical control, and that's where the fighters are responsible for the intercept, but the controller's passing pertinent information along to them as they carry out the task. And it's important to note that in the case of tactical control, that information is going to be relative to the fighters that the information is being provided to. When we get to examples later, that will make sense. But that information is really only useful to that specific fighter or fighter group that are working together. And finally, we have broadcast control. And in broadcast, the fighter's planning and executing the intercept. The controller's providing information, but the information is being given from a particular, it's called the bullseye, or the bulls. And it's going to be a reference point laid out that all the fighters are aware of, so everyone in the area is able to use that information. So I got a little ahead of myself and kind of already discussed what the bullseye format is, and that's used for broadcast control. For tactical control, the BRA format is used, and BRA is bearing, range, altitude, and aspect. Bearing is the magnetic bearing from the fighter to the contact. Range is the slant range in nautical miles from the fighter to the contact. Altitude is the contact in thousands of feet. And aspect, we'll get into later. I'm going to show you a graphic for that a little later on. So any information passed from a controller during an intercept is going to contain at least three things: the location of the contact, the altitude, and the direction of movement. What's really going to change is what that information is relative to. So the information is either going to be relative to the bullseye or relative to the fighter group that's being controlled. The other thing AWACS is going to try to do if they have the information is declare what the contact is. So the different kind of declarations you'll receive are here up on the screen. Hostile, the contact meets the criteria. In the ROE, the rules of engagement and weapons employment is authorized. So we know they're bad and we're allowed to shoot them. Bandit means that we've identified them as an enemy, but they haven't met the ROE for us to go ahead and engage them. Bogey is when a contact's identity is unknown. And in this case, the AWACS may actually ask the fighter or fighter group to go in and get a positive ID using some kind of sensor. That might be a camera, it might be just flying up to it and getting a visual if it's not presenting a threat. Friendly, of course, means the contact is friendly. Standby, unable, is not a declaration, but it means that the controller is unable to ascertain the identity of the contact. So we have the graphic up on the screen now that I mentioned earlier, and this is going to talk about the different aspects that we'll get into, and when we get into the examples I'll have this superimposed right on top of the image. But basically, hot is if the contact aspect is within 0 or 30 degrees relative to the reference point. All of this is going to be relative to the reference point. If you're getting an aspect, it generally is going to be directed at a certain flight. I think generally all the time it's going to be directed at a certain flight. But if you're overhearing this as in another flight, that aspect won't be pertinent to your situation unless you're in a similar area to the flight that is receiving the information. Flank is the contact being 30 to 60 degrees relative. Beam, 60 to 120 degrees relative. And drag, 120 to 180, so they're moving away from you. And again, later we'll have a better visual example here. So we're going to look at some visual illustrations now, and I've produced these wonderful graphics for your enjoyment. We've got a friendly fighter, an AWACS, hostile contact, a neutral unknown contact, and a bullseye, and we're all going to be making a trip to Monkey Island. This is Monkey Island, and it is orientated with the top of the map being the north, the bottom being the south, and so on. And yes, it is actually that Monkey Island. It looks a little bit different than it used to, but there was an earthquake, and a fire, and probably a flood too. Just deal with it. So I'm going to drop an AWACS there in the bottom left, and a bullseye up there in the top left. So the bullseye is in the north, the AWACS is in the south, and they're on the west border of the island. And now we have our heroic friendly fighter flying in from the west, and our awful enemy fighter flying in from the northeast. What's going to happen now is AWACS is going to provide information to our friendly fighter so he can get out there and intercept the enemy. And we'll start with a broadcast. So in a broadcast, the first thing an AWACS is going to give you is a bearing. And the bearing is, as discussed, going to be relative to the bullseye. So I've got a compass there, and you can see from the bullseye, the hostile is at 078 degrees. The next piece of information they will give you is the range. And in this scenario, it's 80 nautical miles, 80 nautical miles. The next piece of information we're going to get is the altitude. So in this case, it's 5,000 feet above mean sea level MSL. And all altitude information you're going to get from AWACS is going to be MSL, not AGL. They're also going to tell us that the hostile is moving south. So we have a bearing of 078 degrees, a range of 80 nautical miles, and an altitude of 5,000 feet, and the contact is tracking south. And that's going to sound something like,
Magic single group bulls 078 for 80, 5,000, track south, bandit.
and you'll see that they put the declaration at the end because they know it's a bandit in this case. Next, we're going to look at the tactical control, specifically using the BRA format. We're still in the same scenario here, but we can see the situation's progressed a little bit. So our fighter's flown inland, and the enemy has, the hostile has turned down towards us and our AWACS. So now that we're in tactical control, all the information that AWACS is going to give us is going to be relative to our position rather than the bullseye. So just like last time, the first piece of information we're going to get is the bearing, which in this case is 077 degrees. The next piece of information we're going to get is the range, and again in this scenario the range is 70 nautical miles. Then we'll get the altitude, which is 7,000 feet. And finally, we're going to get their aspect relative to us. In this scenario, because they're coming towards us, they're going to be hot. And I've imposed the graphic that we saw earlier over this, so we can kind of see what it would look like if they were flanking. So if the hostile there was kind of heading up to the northwest in that purple zone, they'd be flanking. If they were going either straight north or south, they'd be a beam or beaming. And if they were in the blue area moving away from us, they'd be drag, or a lot of people say cold because it's the opposite of hot. Get it? So the information we have: bearing 077 degrees, range 70 nautical miles, altitude 7,000 feet, aspect hot, and that's our BRA. So when they say this, it's going to sound something like
Magic single group 077 for 7,000 hot bandit.
And again, in this scenario, they know it's a hostile, so they're going to call that a bandit. And before we wrap this up, I want to look at a contact that we don't have a declaration for. So in this case, a group of helicopters has just taken off. You've got them on your radar, and AWACS hasn't passed any information on, but you know you're going to be running into them pretty quick here, and you want to get a declaration. So what you're actually going to do in this case is call AWACS and ask them to declare. So you'll call them and say, Magic Victory 1-1 contact BRA 090 for 40,000 declare. And what you've done there is you've told Magic that you have a contact at 090 relative to you. They're 40 miles away and they're 2,000 feet above sea level on your radar. And and declare, obviously you're asking them to tell you to categorize them. And they can reply,
Victory 1-1 Magic single group BRA 090 for 42,000 bogey.
So they've told you that's a bogey, which means they don't know what it is either. In this scenario, they may ask you to go check it out, to get your camera on it, or to get visual ID with the Mark I eyeball. You might not always get a clear declaration every time. So bear that in mind. And that concludes our first very basic, simplified introduction to air intercept control. Join us next time while we continue the liberation of Monkey Island.